She came only at night, stealing scraps from backyards, slipping through fences like a ghost. To the neighbors, she was a nuisance. But to him, Daniel, a tired mechanic with a broken past, she was something else entirely. One night, he followed her, and what he discovered in the shadows would break his heart, and maybe heal it too, because behind every act of desperation, there's a story waiting to be heard. And this one, it begins with a thief and ends with love. The neighborhood of West Hollow had long since stopped expecting miracles. It was a forgotten patch of town, a cluster of rusted trailers and sagging houses pressed against the highway, where most folks worked with their hands and came home with aching backs and empty wallets. The winters came early and overstayed their welcome. Summers were dry, cracking the earth and hearts alike. In a small weather-beaten house at the end of Bramble Street lived Daniel Keene, a 48-year-old auto mechanic with oil in his veins and silence in his bones. Tall, broad-shouldered, with suntanned skin and calloused hands, Daniel moved with the weight of years that weren't entirely his own. Grief had etched itself into the corners of his eyes. His wife, Marlene, had passed from breast cancer nearly 8 years ago, and their only son, Luke, had been lost 2 years later in a car accident barely a mile from home. Since then, Daniel lived alone, working long hours at the small garage down by the gas station, speaking mostly in nods and grunts. He rarely laughed, and when he did, it was a quiet, hollow thing. The only color in his yard came from an old wooden swing, now motionless, tangled in weeds. Luke's swing, untouched since the accident. Recently, something strange had been happening in West Hollow. Food was disappearing. Not entire meals, but scraps, a half sandwich left on a porch, a pack of hot dogs gone from a cooler, some leftover stew left out for the cats. It started with whispers. "It's raccoons," someone said. Or junkies, another muttered. But then the sightings began. "There's a dog," old Mrs. Glenda swore. "A big mangy mutt with wild eyes. I saw it slinking through my yard at midnight. It's been stealing." Mrs. Glenda was 72, a retired school teacher with an immaculate yard and a memory sharper than most. She was short, round, and fiercely protective of her garden gnomes and her tabby cats. No one dared question her word. Soon, traps were set, motion sensor lights installed, children warned to keep their distance. Some even talked of calling animal control. Daniel had heard the rumors. At first, he didn't pay them much mind. He wasn't one to get swept up in neighborhood drama. But then it happened to him. It was a Thursday evening when he left a takeout box of fried chicken on the back steps, forgotten in his rush to catch the last half of a boxing match rerun. When he returned less than 15 minutes later, the box was gone. No wrapper, no crumbs, just gone. The next night, he did it again. This time, he left out a slice of ham. Again, it vanished. But Daniel noticed something strange. The food was never eaten on the spot. There were no bite marks, no torn packaging. Whatever, or whoever, was taking it, was carrying it away. He could have been angry. Others certainly were. But something in Daniel hesitated. The way the food vanished so carefully, it didn't feel like the work of a scavenger. It felt like the work of someone desperate. So he did something different. He waited. The third night, he turned off all the lights, pulled a chair to the edge of his back porch, and sat in silence. His breath fogged in the cool evening air. The stars flickered above, mostly hidden by the yellow haze of the town's forgotten street lamps. For over an hour, there was nothing but the usual chorus of crickets and distant cars. Then he heard it. A soft shuffle in the grass, a low, almost imperceptible whimper. He narrowed his eyes and saw her. She emerged from the edge of the bushes like a shadow come to life. A medium-sized dog with coarse brown and black fur matted with dirt, her ribs visible beneath the coat. Her ears were half torn, her tail lowered submissively. But her eyes were haunting, wide, dark, alert. Eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. She approached the food cautiously, looked around, sniffed the air, and then, in one fluid motion, she picked up the sandwich in her mouth, whole, and turned to disappear into the night. She didn't eat. Not a single bite. Daniel stood slowly, breath caught in his throat. That wasn't theft. That was transport. Purpose. He grabbed his coat and flashlight and followed her. Down the alley, across the abandoned lot, past the rusted fence behind the old supermarket. The dog never once looked back, as if guided by an invisible thread. She moved quickly, but limped slightly on her back left leg. Finally, she squeezed through a gap in a rotting wooden fence, vanishing into what used to be a playground. Daniel ducked after her. What he saw next stole the air from his lungs. 5 tiny figures huddled beneath a fallen slide. Puppies, no older than a few weeks, trembling in the cold. They yelped excitedly as the mother approached, tails wagging furiously. She dropped the sandwich at their paws and immediately began licking one of the weaker pups, encouraging it to eat. She hadn't eaten in days, that much was clear. But her pups, she'd walked miles, stolen from angry humans, and carried food back each night. Not for herself, but for them. Daniel stood frozen in the dark, his flashlight dimmed to a flicker. The emotion hit him like a tidal wave. He was staring at a mother with nothing left but her children, and the will to keep them alive. In that moment, Daniel Keene remembered the countless nights he'd stayed up beside Marlene's hospital bed, the months he'd spent driving Luke to physical therapy after the accident, the way he'd pour everything he had into them, even when it meant he went without. He knew that look, that desperation, that love. It wasn't just a dog in front of him. It was a soul fighting to protect its last reason to live. And he was a man who hadn't felt connected to anything in years, until now. The next morning, the sky was a dull canvas of gray, sagging low over West Hollow as if mourning some unspoken sorrow. Daniel stood by his back fence, staring at the place where the mother dog had disappeared into the night, still haunted by the sight of her and her starving puppies. Something had stirred in him, a feeling he hadn't let himself touch in years. Pity, yes, but something deeper, too. Recognition. He didn't sleep much that night. By the break of dawn, Daniel was back at the mechanic's shop, his mind not on brake pads or fan belts, but on the mother dog and her little ones. He worked with a strange urgency, finishing a transmission job 2 hours ahead of schedule. By lunch, he was rummaging through the supply room for a roll of thick canvas and an old space heater that hadn't worked in years. The heater would stay in the corner, more symbolic than practical. This wasn't about comfort. It was about giving something, anything. That evening, Daniel dug into the far end of his backyard where a moldy canvas tent had been folded and forgotten under the tool shed. It had belonged to his son, Luke, a birthday gift for the boy's 9th birthday. Luke had used it once during a backyard camping trip, complete with flashlights and roasted marshmallows, back when laughter still lived in the Keene household. Daniel brushed off the dirt, unfolded it, and spent the better part of 2 hours setting it up beneath the shade of the sycamore tree. The tent was lopsided, one pole was splintered, but it stood. He laid down old towels and 2 heavy blankets he didn't mind sacrificing to the elements. A stainless steel bowl filled with water sat beside another, with torn pieces of cooked chicken and a few dog biscuits he picked up on the way home. It was a trap of sorts, but not the kind others in West Hollow were setting. This one was lined with softness. That night, he left the tent door open and the porch light off. The mother dog didn't come, not the next night either, but Daniel kept leaving food. Kept checking the bowls. Each time the food was gone, no mess, no sign of struggle. Just careful teeth and silent retreat. And still, she stayed away. Until the 5th night. Daniel had fallen asleep on the porch swing, flannel jacket wrapped tightly around him when he heard the soft scrape of paws. He stirred, but didn't move, letting his breath fall steady and slow. She stood at the edge of the yard, silhouetted by moonlight, a shadow with ears. Her ribs still jutted sharply beneath her patchy coat, but her eyes had changed. They weren't wild anymore. They were wary, but curious. She crept forward slowly, every muscle taut, every step calculated. And then she stepped inside the tent. Daniel exhaled softly. The next morning, she was gone, but the bowls were licked clean, and a faint indentation in the blanket proved she'd stayed a while. So the ritual began. Each evening he prepared the tent. Fresh food, water, sometimes a piece of his own dinner if it was warm enough. And each night she came. Some nights she brought a pup with her. Just one, usually the strongest. She'd nuzzle it onto the blanket, let it curl up, then disappear into the darkness to fetch the others. Their trust was being built, not through force, not with cages, but with patience. And Daniel found himself watching through the window, not just to ensure they were safe, but because something about the scene filled a void he hadn't known was still aching. One rainy night, as thunder rolled through the hills, she came late. Daniel was just about to go check when he saw her limp through the gate, drenched and bleeding slightly from her left shoulder. She dropped onto the blanket with a grunt, 3 puppies trailing her like ducklings. One stumbled, coughing. Another was visibly smaller than the rest, with cloudy eyes and a slow gait. Daniel couldn't help himself. He stepped out, holding a towel. Slowly, carefully. The mother growled low in her throat, not menacing, but warning. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice quiet, rusty from disuse. "Just want to help." He sat on the wet grass, letting the towel soak in the mud. One of the pups approached him out of instinct, sniffed his boot. Daniel didn't move. The mother watched, her ears flicking with each raindrop. And then, to his disbelief, she lay her head down. That night, he named her Hope. The name wasn't meant to be poetic. It was just the word that came to mind when he looked at her. In the days that followed, Daniel built a barrier around the tent using plywood sheets and tarp, shielding it from the wind. He reinforced the floor with old pallets. When payday came, he drove across town to the pet supply store, a place he hadn't stepped into in years. The cashier, a young woman named Leah with short pink hair and tired eyes, raised an eyebrow at his basket. 5 bowls, heating pads, soft food, flea shampoo. Getting a new dog? No, Daniel replied. Already got one. Kinda. She chuckled. Well, sounds like she hit the jackpot. Leah was friendly but reserved, with the air of someone who smiled out of politeness more than joy. She wore long sleeves even in the summer, and her wrists bore the faint, pale lines of battles fought in silence. Daniel didn't ask. He just nodded, appreciating the small kindness in her tone. Later that evening, as he watched Hope eat beside her puppies, memories began to rise, uninvited but familiar. Hospitals, lukewarm soup containers, the beeping of machines. He had spent months bringing meals to Luke in the children's wing, knowing the boy could barely stomach broth. But it had made Daniel feel like he was doing something, anything. Parents will do anything to feel useful when everything else is out of their hands. And now, watching Hope curl around her puppies, licking the smallest one with slow, deliberate care, Daniel felt the same ache swell in his chest. She was doing what he had done, sacrificing everything for those too small to understand the cost. That night, as the wind howled outside, Daniel stood by the window and whispered to no one, "You're not just a dog, you're a mother, just like I was a father." A connection was growing, not out of convenience, but out of shared scars, hers on her body, his in his soul. Neither of them had meant to end up this way, but somehow, together, the silence was beginning to break. The mornings had begun to carry a strange warmth for Daniel, an unfamiliar anticipation that stirred in his chest even before the sun reached over the cracked rooftops of West Hollow. It had been almost 3 weeks since Hope and her pups had entered his life, and slowly, carefully, she was learning to trust him. Not fully, not yet, but her eyes no longer held that constant flicker of fear. When he approached the tent now, she no longer stood guard. Instead, she remained curled beside her pups, ears perked but tail calm, watching him with a cautious acceptance. The pups, however, had no such reservations. They were 6 in total, each with their own quirks. The largest, whom Daniel called Tank, was a burly, clumsy ball of black and tan, always the first to stumble out of the tent. Then there was Skippy, the quickest of the bunch, lean and wiry with white toes and a constant wagging tail. The smallest, whom he hadn't yet named, worried him most. Pale beige with faint patches of gray, she seemed weak, her breaths often shallow, her movements sluggish. Hope watched over them with a fierce maternal gaze. She was no beauty. Her fur still bore the tangles and scars of her time on the streets, and one of her ears hung in a torn crescent. Her hind leg, Daniel noticed, didn't seem to move right. At first he thought it was a minor limp, but after seeing her collapse momentarily while climbing the porch step, he knew it was worse. One morning, he knelt just outside the tent with a bowl of warmed oatmeal and chicken, and for the first time, Hope didn't flinch when his hand reached forward. With a patience born from grief and years of solitude, Daniel inched closer, gently placing the food beside her paws. He remained there, silent and still, while the puppies clambered over his boots and chewed on his coat hem. And then, something remarkable happened. Hope leaned forward and rested her nose against his knee, just for a second, before turning to nuzzle her weakest pup. That brief touch held more meaning than any words he could recall in years. It was a gesture of trust, of shared understanding. That evening the wind picked up harshly, and clouds rolled in thick and low. Rain was coming, heavy and unkind. Daniel stood at the window, staring at the tent swaying beneath the sycamore. He bit the inside of his cheek, then turned to the garage. The space was cluttered, dusty, and smelled faintly of old rubber and gasoline. But it was dry and warm. Once it had been his sanctuary, a place where he and Luke would tinker with bikes, build wooden carts, dream up inventions that never worked, but always made them laugh. Since the accident, he had avoided it like a grave. Now, that space needed a new purpose. He spent hours clearing out old shelves and sweeping the floor. He laid blankets beside a portable heater, plugged in a dim lamp, and even positioned an old dog crate in the corner, lined with towels. It wasn't much, but it was more than a tent. When the rain began, he opened the back gate and called softly into the dark. "Come on, girl, it's time." Hope hesitated at the doorway. The pups were already darting through the grass, barking and tumbling over each other. But she lingered, staring into the garage as though it were a trap she couldn't quite decode. "I won't close the door," he promised. "You can leave any time. Just not tonight, all right?" Hope limped forward. Slowly, step by cautious step, she entered the garage. The moment her paw touched the dry floor, Daniel felt something lift from his shoulders. Maybe it was Luke's ghost, or Marlene's, or maybe just the quiet absolution of doing something right. From that night on, the garage became their home. Daniel changed his routine to fit theirs. He rose earlier to prepare breakfast. Scrambled eggs, kibble, sometimes a bit of cheese if he could spare it. He made nightly supply runs, stretching every dollar from his paychecks to buy flea medicine, puppy milk, antibiotics. Every small cough, every limp, every odd sound had him researching into the night. The old desktop in his bedroom glowed with tabs like treating parvovirus in puppies and home remedies for infected dog wounds. One Saturday morning while cleaning the crate, he noticed a faint line of blood on the floor. His heart sank. Kneeling beside Hope, he examined her hind leg more closely. Beneath the fur, a deep gash festered, likely infected, possibly from an old trap or wire. It wasn't healing on its own. That same afternoon, Daniel packed her gently into a laundry basket lined with towels and drove across town to the only place he knew might help, Eastside Animal Clinic, a small building with chipped paint but warm light. Inside, he met Dr. Sarah Ellington. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and slender, with sharp cheekbones, sandy blonde hair tied in a no-nonsense ponytail, and tired green eyes that suggested she had seen too much in her line of work. She wore jeans, a faded hoodie beneath her lab coat, and sneakers that looked like they had survived a hurricane. But her voice was steady, low, and kind. She listened as Daniel explained everything, how Hope came to him, the puppies, the wound. She didn't interrupt, just nodded and knelt beside the dog, examining her with practiced, gentle hands. "She's lucky," Sarah said after a moment. "Infection hasn't spread too far yet, but we'll need to clean and stitch it today. It'll take time." Daniel's shoulders slumped. "I don't have much. Not money, I mean." Sarah stood, pulling off her gloves. "You have heart. That counts for something around here." They worked together in silence, Daniel assisting where he could, holding Hope's paw, murmuring soft words as the vet treated the wound. Later, in the clinic's small waiting room, Sarah handed him a paper bag of antibiotics and ointment. "No charge today," she said, waving away his protest. "But you'll owe me a story next time. You've got the face of a man who's lived 100 lives." He nodded, awkwardly touched. That night, back in the garage, he watched Hope as she slept, her leg bandaged, her pups curled beside her. The smallest one, the frail little girl, had been named at last, Daisy. He had whispered the name without thinking as he watched her sneeze and crawl across a blanket. It was Marlene's favorite flower. He hadn't said the name aloud in years. Now it echoed in the small garage like a promise. He sat on the cold floor, back against the wall, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel Keene let himself cry. Not from sadness, not entirely, but from something else, something that felt like healing. The days passed with a quiet rhythm now, an unexpected harmony between man and beast. Every morning, Daniel rose before the sun, fixed breakfast for Hope and her pups, checked their health, cleaned the garage floor, then walked the short route to work with a strange spring in his step. For the first time in years, his days had purpose. Not grand or world-changing, but steady and good. That was enough. But Daisy, little, trembling Daisy, remained fragile. She was improving, but barely. Every cough tightened Daniel's chest. Every whimper in the night stirred him from sleep. It was during one of those restless nights, sitting cross-legged on a blanket beside the pups, that Daniel made up his mind. He had to go back to the clinic. Back to Sarah. But when he called the next morning, her receptionist informed him that Sarah would be away for the next 10 days, volunteering at a rural rescue mission for farm animals in Nebraska. "She's always doing that," the woman chuckled. "You'd think she had a twin." "I don't suppose there's someone else?" Daniel asked. "Dr. Eliza Miller. She's new. Only been here a few months, but she's good. Really good." Daniel paused. New meant unknown. Unknown meant risk. But he didn't have time to be cautious. Daisy was getting weaker. That afternoon he returned to the East Side Animal Clinic, this time with Hope in tow, and Daisy nestled gently inside a crate, wrapped in his old work shirt. The sky was overcast, and the scent of coming rain hung in the air like a warning. He walked briskly, ignoring the twinge in his knee and the curious stares of passers-by. The bell chimed softly as he pushed open the clinic door. Inside, the reception area smelled of antiseptic and lavender. Posters of smiling dogs and declawed cats lined the pale blue walls. Behind the counter stood a young woman, not the receptionist from before, but someone entirely new. Dr. Eliza Miller looked barely 30. She had a gentle, willowy presence, with auburn curls tied in a loose braid down her back, pale skin freckled from sun exposure, and large gray eyes that radiated sincerity. She wore a slightly oversized white coat over a navy blue blouse and jeans, and her shoes, Converse high tops painted with tiny paw prints, suggested a touch of whimsy beneath the calm professionalism. "Mr. Keene," she said, stepping forward with a clipboard. Her voice was soft but clear, like a violin string played slowly. "You called about Hope and the puppy?" He nodded. "The little one, Daisy, she's not doing well." Eliza knelt beside the crate, her movements fluid and unhurried. She peeked inside, whispering to Daisy, then gently lifted the pup into her arms. Daisy's legs dangled weakly, her nose twitching. "She's underweight," Eliza murmured, examining the puppy's gums, then checking her heartbeat. "Breathing shallow. She's fighting something, but we can help her." Daniel watched her every move, his fists unconsciously clenching. He hadn't realized how protective he'd become. Eliza looked up. "Let's get her on fluids and run a few tests. I'll be quick." She disappeared behind a door, leaving Daniel in the waiting room with Hope, who whined and scratched at the crate. As the minutes passed, Daniel's mind wandered. He looked down at Hope, whose tired eyes were fixed on the door where Eliza had vanished. "You miss her already, don't you?" he whispered. "You're a better parent than most people I know." He exhaled slowly, the weight of memory pressing down on his shoulders. The smell of antiseptic brought him back to another waiting room, years ago, staring at beige walls while Marlene's chemo treatments dragged on inside. Then another memory, colder still, of the pediatric ward, Luke's tiny fingers gripping his shirt while he wheezed through a mask. There had been no miracle, only slow, quiet endings. The door opened. Eliza returned, holding Daisy in one hand and a printout in the other. "We're giving her a mild antibiotic. It's respiratory, but caught early. With the right care, she'll recover." Daniel's knees almost buckled with relief. He knelt beside Hope and stroked the side of her face. "Hear that, girl? She's gonna be okay." Hope wagged her tail once. "I know money's tight," Eliza said gently, "but don't worry, this one's on me." Daniel looked up, surprised. "Why?" She smiled, just a flicker. "Because anyone who takes in a stray with 6 puppies, builds a shelter in his garage, and walks 4 miles to my clinic with a limping dog in the rain, is someone I want to help." Daniel lowered his gaze, trying to hide the emotion tightening in his throat. "You're not the only one who's lost someone," she added, softer now. "I had a brother, Marcus. car crash. He was only 16. After that, I stopped going to church, stopped trusting people. But animals, they don't lie. They don't hurt you out of spite. That's why I became a vet. I guess we all find our way back through something." Daniel stood slowly, his voice rough. "I lost my son too. Luke, 10 years old, a drunk driver. My wife didn't make it long after." Eliza reached into her pocket and handed him a tissue. No judgment, no pity. Just quiet understanding. Back at the house, the garage seemed different, livelier. Hope settled in quickly, licking Daisy clean before curling around her protectively. The pups had grown louder, braver, more curious. Tank now barked at his own reflection. Skippy had discovered how to leap over the crate wall. And Daisy slept. But her breathing was deeper now, steadier. That night, Daniel didn't retreat to his bedroom. He stayed in the garage, leaning against the wall, watching them. As he dozed off, memories stirred. Of holding Luke against his chest during thunderstorms, of Marlene's humming while folding laundry, of laughter once so ordinary it had gone unappreciated. But it was more than memory. It was something being rebuilt. Not replaced, never replaced, but reformed. These dogs weren't his family, but in their need, in their innocence, they had given him something to protect again, a reason to wake up, a reason to hope. And as he stared at Daisy's tiny chest rising and falling, Daniel Keene, grieving husband, broken father, quiet man of the working class, felt something return to his soul. A light. Not bright, not yet, but it was there. And for the first time in a long, long while, he let it stay. The arrival of spring had transformed the air in West Hollow. Snow had finally loosened its grip, and timid green shoots emerged along fence lines and sidewalks, as if unsure whether the world was ready for softness again. But with the thawing came something colder in its own way, curiosity and judgment. It began with the barking. The puppies, now 6 weeks old, were louder, braver, and far more chaotic. Every morning brought a symphony of yelps, tumbling paws, and playful growls from Daniel's garage. The old man who used to walk past with a nod now paused to peer suspiciously through the fence. Children whispered as they rode their bikes by the house. Trash cans were suddenly upright, lids replaced, lawns trimmed, like the neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something to go wrong. Daniel had known it wouldn't stay quiet forever. On a Thursday morning, while carrying a fresh batch of blankets to the garage, he found someone waiting by his front gate. Her name was Janet Malone, a longtime resident of West Hollow. In her late 50s, Janet was tall, wiry, and always dressed in neutral tones that matched her no-nonsense tone. Her hair was tightly curled, silvery at the roots, and her lips pursed as if she were perpetually on the verge of disapproval. Once a nurse, Janet now spent her days organizing local events and reporting anything out of place to the HOA, even though their street technically had no active committee. She folded her arms as Daniel approached. "I've been hearing things," she said without preamble. "People usually do," he replied, setting down the blanket. "Dogs," she clarified. "Strays, barking all hours. Kids say they've seen a whole pack running in and out of your garage." "They're not a pack," Daniel said. "They're a family. And they're staying here until they're healthy enough to find homes." Janet narrowed her eyes. "You can't just run a shelter from your garage. It's not sanitary. What if one of them bites someone?" "They won't." "Still," she sniffed, "it's not just your business, Mr. Keene. It affects all of us. We don't want trouble here." Daniel's jaw tensed. He didn't raise his voice, just nodded once and walked past her. But trouble, once spoken aloud, has a way of manifesting. By the weekend, 3 more neighbors had stopped by to express concerns. One left an anonymous note in Daniel's mailbox, warning that they'd report the situation if it wasn't handled. Another called animal control. But when the officer arrived, a young man with a kind face and an obvious love for dogs, he merely advised Daniel to keep the garage clean and ensure vaccinations were updated. He even knelt to scratch behind Hope's ears and said quietly, "You're doing more good than most people would bother." Still, the tension lingered. Daniel began waking earlier, ensuring the yard was spotless, barking minimized, food bowls hidden. He didn't want war with his neighbors. He just wanted peace for the pups, for Hope, and maybe for himself. Then, on a crisp Sunday afternoon, the tide shifted. It happened because of a child. Mason Riley, age 9, lived 3 houses down. He was small for his age, with shaggy brown hair and an oversized hoodie that hung nearly to his knees. Mason had always been a quiet boy, often seen drawing on the sidewalk with chalk or trailing ants with a magnifying glass. His father worked nights, his mother often forgot to pick him up from school. Mason had found comfort in animals the way some kids find it in stories. Something pure and safe in a world that wasn't always either. Unbeknownst to Daniel, Mason had been watching. He had seen Daniel carrying Daisy to the vet. He had watched the old man rock one of the puppies in his lap on a windy night. And most of all, he had noticed how gentle Daniel was. How kind. So, when Mason overheard his mother telling Mrs. Malone over the phone that old Keen's turning into a stray magnet, he said softly, "He's not hurting them. He's helping them. The puppies follow him around like he's their dad." His mother paused, then lowered her voice. "Are you sure?" Mason nodded. "He fixed up the whole garage. I saw him tuck the little sick one in a blanket." By Monday morning, Mason's words had floated through the neighborhood like pollen on wind. Whispers became questions, then interest, then, unexpectedly, support. 3 days later, Daniel heard the knock on his door. A young woman stood outside, holding a clipboard and a hopeful smile. She introduced herself as Rachel Lynn, 27 years old, volunteer coordinator for a small rescue group called Hearts and Paws. She was petite with short black hair, round glasses, and an energetic energy that filled the porch like sunshine. "We heard about the dogs," she said brightly, "and about what you've been doing. A little boy named Mason told his teacher, and she emailed us. We'd love to help." Daniel blinked, stunned. "You want to help?" Rachel nodded. "We work with fosters, vets, adoption centers. If you're willing, we can assist in placing the pups, maybe help build a better shelter here in the meantime." Within hours, 3 more volunteers arrived, 2 college students and an older man named Hector, who used to train police dogs. They worked through the afternoon, helping Daniel clean the garage again, patch a drafty wall, and build a temporary playpen in the backyard using donated fencing. That night, Daniel stood at the doorway of the garage, watching the pups chase each other in circles. Hope lay on a folded quilt, her eyes following them with quiet pride. Daisy had grown stronger. She still limped, still tired easily, but now she barked with the others, nibbled at Tank's ear, and curled into Daniel's lap every evening like she had done it her whole life. As the sky turned gold and the sun dipped low, Daniel felt a presence beside him. It was Rachel, her clipboard now forgotten, her gaze fixed on the pups. "You've given them something most animals never get," she said. "A second chance." Daniel nodded slowly. "I think they gave it to me first." Rachel smiled and didn't say anything more. That night, Daniel sat in the garage longer than usual. He watched Hope lick each pup clean before curling into sleep. He watched Daisy twitch in a dream, her legs kicking softly. And he thought of Luke, of how he used to do the same thing as a baby. Of Marlene, brushing hair from Daniel's forehead when he came home late. The past still hurt. It always would. But now, in the chaos of barking and wagging tails, in the soft weight of Daisy's head against his arm, Daniel felt something else. Not just healing, but the beginning of belonging. Again. The days had grown longer, the light stretching its fingers further into the evening, as if trying to hold on to something beautiful before darkness fell. West Hollow no longer whispered about Daniel Keen with suspicion. Now they waved. Sometimes, people even stopped to drop off old towels or bags of food, offering shy smiles and quiet words of support. And the puppies, once fragile, skittish things, had become bold, bounding through the backyard like tiny, joyful comets. Their legs still wobbly, but their hearts fearless. But hope. Hope had begun to fade. It started with her appetite. One morning she barely touched her food. Then came the shortness of breath. The limp returned, heavier than before. By the 3rd evening, Daniel noticed that her once vigilant gaze had dulled. The spark that had carried her across rain and snow, through wire fences and broken streets, was dimming. Daniel had seen decline before. He'd seen it in Marlene when the chemo no longer worked. He had seen it in Luke, when even laughter couldn't mask the pain in his bones. There was a certain stillness, a kind of surrender, not of weakness but of completion. Now he saw it again. In the way Hope rested her head without lifting it, and how she no longer rose when her pups tumbled over her belly. Daniel called the clinic and Eliza picked up. Her voice, normally steady and warm, dipped into something softer when he told her. "She's done everything she came to do," Eliza said. "Sometimes animals know before we do." He wanted to ask if there was anything more they could try. Another medicine, a treatment, a miracle. But he didn't. He knew. That evening, Daniel moved Hope into the house. He didn't want her to spend her final hours in the garage, no matter how lovingly it had been transformed. He carried her gently in his arms. She was lighter than he remembered, and laid her on the worn couch in the living room. He wrapped her in one of Luke's old flannel blankets and sat beside her, resting her head on his lap. Outside, the puppies played in the dusk, unaware. Daisy barked at a passing moth. Skippy dug furiously into the corner of the yard, convinced treasure lay beneath. Tank sat in the water bowl again, proud of his absurd decisions. Inside, the world was quieter. Daniel spoke to her softly, as he once did to his son during long nights in the hospital. "You remember the first time I saw you? You were just a shadow stealing my dinner. And now look at you. You built a life here. You raised them right." Hope didn't respond, but her tail gave the faintest twitch. He stroked the patch of fur behind her ear, where the scar from her old wound still showed. He thought of all she had endured: cold, hunger, injury, and how, even with a body battered by the world, she had never once failed her children. For hours he stayed like that, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent. Once he fell asleep, and when he woke in the middle of the night, the room was bathed in soft moonlight filtering through the curtains. Hope hadn't moved, but her eyes were open, gazing up at him. Daniel leaned down and whispered, "You can rest now." And then she did. The morning came gentle, as if nature itself understood that loud things would not be welcome. The pups were fed early, corralled into the playpen by the volunteers who arrived quietly, sensing the shift in the air. Even Mason, the little boy from down the street, showed up with a bundle of flowers he'd picked himself, mostly dandelions and weeds, but full of meaning. Daniel buried Hope beneath the old sycamore tree in the backyard, the same tree whose roots had once nearly cracked his foundation, but now felt like sacred ground. He wrapped her carefully, hands shaking only once. The pups sat in a loose cluster nearby, watching curiously, as if sensing this was no ordinary morning. Rachel from Hearts and Paws stayed with him, helping dig the small grave. She didn't say much, just placed a smooth stone beside the mound when it was done, then stood back. She was a mother, Daniel said finally. That's all she wanted to be. Rachel touched his arm, and she was a good one. Later that afternoon, Daniel sat on the porch. The puppies ran wild in the yard, Skippy chasing a fluttering leaf, Daisy nipping playfully at Tank's ears, the others tumbling and rolling in a pile of bark and joy. The sun warmed their coats, painting everything golden. For a moment, Daniel simply watched. He hadn't smiled in a long time. Not really. But now, as Daisy trotted over to him, tail wagging furiously, he felt it begin to rise. He reached down and lifted her into his lap, her tiny body warm against his chest. She looked up at him with those familiar eyes, soft, trusting, full of life. And in that moment, Daniel felt something click into place. A piece of himself, lost long ago, now returned. It wasn't the same. It would never be the same. But it was something, a new chapter. He wasn't just a man living alone in a weathered house anymore. He was a caretaker, a protector, a father again, not by blood, but by bond. And in that, there was healing. There was light. Spring came to West Hollow not with thunder or spectacle, but with quiet persistence. The frost melted, revealing soft earth beneath. Trees that had stood bare for months began to whisper in green again. And in Daniel Keene's backyard, where sorrow had once taken root, life had begun to bloom anew. The puppies were no longer puppies in the fragile sense. Their legs had grown stronger, their eyes brighter, their barks more confident. They no longer clung to Daniel's pant legs for balance. Now they chased one another across the lawn with the kind of wild joy only young creatures possess, untouched by grief, full of wonder. Each week, one by one, they left. Rachel and the volunteers from Hearts and Paws had worked tirelessly to screen adopters, families with big yards, gentle hands, and patient hearts. Daniel met every single one. He watched the pups wag their tails, lick faces, and settle into new arms with innocence. Still, when each one drove away, Daniel stood at the gate a little longer than necessary, hand resting on the old wooden fence. Tank was the first to go. Adopted by a young couple with twin boys who squealed when he tackled them with his enthusiastic clumsiness. Skippy left next, taken in by a retired fireman who said he hadn't laughed out loud in years until Skippy peed in his boot. And then there was Daisy. Daniel had known, even before the others left, that Daisy would stay. She was Hope's daughter, not just in blood, but in spirit. She was quiet, observant, and always kept close to Daniel, as if tethered by some invisible string. Every time he sat on the porch, she'd curl beside him. When the other pups galloped through the yard, she'd stay near the sycamore tree, staring at the carved stone that marked her mother's grave. He never asked her to stay. He never needed to. One warm Saturday, Rachel returned to the house, not in her volunteer hoodie, but wearing a sundress patterned with golden leaves, clipboard in hand. She smiled as Daisy ran to her, then circled back to Daniel's side. "She's really chosen you," Rachel said. Daniel nodded. "Or maybe I was always hers." Rachel glanced at the half-built wooden kennel in the corner of the yard. "You finishing that?" "Tomorrow," he said. "Had to sand the nameplate first." She raised an eyebrow. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed her a small plank of wood, about the size of a paperback, smooth at the edges. Carved into it in careful block letters were the words, "Hope's Legacy." Rachel traced the letters with her fingers, her throat tightening. "It's perfect," she whispered. That afternoon, Daniel and Rachel worked side by side, hammering the last boards into place. The kennel wasn't elaborate, but it was sturdy. Daniel had measured every inch with Daisy's comfort in mind. When it was done, he affixed the nameplate above the arched entrance. Then he stepped back and let the dog explore it on her own. Daisy sniffed the doorway, patted inside, turned in a circle, then lay down with a satisfied huff. "She approves," Rachel said. Daniel chuckled. "Good, because it's hers." The following weekend, West Hollow held its annual Spring Community Day at the local park. A modest gathering of food trucks, craft tables, and sunburnt neighbors sharing stories over folding chairs and lemonade. For the first time in years, Daniel went. Not as a stranger, but as someone known. Rachel had insisted on creating a small booth titled The Garage Miracle, with printed photos of the rescue story, snapshots of the pups at different stages, Hope sleeping in Daniel's lap, the moment Tank met his adoptive family, and a final shot of Daniel with all 6 puppies tumbling over him like a tidal wave of fur. Children gathered around the table, and even Mason, quiet little Mason, had contributed a drawing. It showed Daniel holding Hope beneath the sycamore tree, with stars twinkling overhead and 6 small puppies forming a halo around them. He had titled it in crayon, "The Father of Dogs." Daniel stood awkwardly near the booth, unsure what to say as neighbors passed by, some offering hugs, others simply a hand on the shoulder. Janet Malone, the same woman who once called animal control, approached quietly and set a bouquet of white daisies at the table. "I was wrong," she said, voice tight. "What you did, it mattered." Daniel nodded. "We all have our moments. Thanks for this." That night, after the crowd had gone, Daniel walked home with Daisy trotting beside him, tongue lolling, tail wagging softly. The air smelled of grass and faint barbecue, and laughter still echoed faintly from distant streets. At the house, he took her off the leash and watched as she darted straight to the kennel, diving into her blankets like a child returning to her favorite dream. Daniel stood for a while, hands in his pockets, eyes on the stars. He had changed. The man who once grunted at neighbors and counted his grief in silence now had people who smiled at him, a community that remembered his name. But more importantly, he had Daisy, and she had him. Inside the house, he placed an old photo of Marlene and Luke on the mantel. He hadn't touched it in years. Now it felt right to bring them back into the room, not as ghosts, but as family. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the kitchen windows, catching flecks of dust that danced like tiny angels. Daniel poured 2 bowls of food, one for himself, one for Daisy, and stepped outside. She was sitting at the edge of the porch, ears alert, watching birds flit across the yard. He sat beside her, legs stretched out, and patted her gently on the head. "You ready for breakfast, little one?" he said. Daisy perked up, tail wagging. It was the first time he had called her that. He didn't know where the name came from. Perhaps something Marlene used to say, or maybe something Hope had whispered in those last quiet hours. But it felt right, like a new chapter, like love passed down. Daisy barked once, then nestled her head into his lap. And as the sun climbed higher over West Hollow, Daniel Keene, once broken, once lost, smiled into the warmth of a brand new morning. Sometimes the ones who steal our food aren't thieves. They're mothers, survivors, messengers of grace. And sometimes the people we believe are broken beyond repair are the very ones chosen to carry healing forward. Hope didn't have much, only her body, her courage, and her love. But with that, she saved her puppies. And in doing so, she saved a man. Daniel gave them shelter, but they gave him back his heart. It's in the smallest moments, a paw on your lap, a soft breath at night, a child's drawing, that we rediscover what it means to be human, to belong, to be loved again. Let us remember, redemption doesn't always come in grand miracles. Sometimes it arrives on 4 muddy paws, with a tail that still dares to wag. May God bless you and your loved ones with the same quiet courage that lived in Hope, the same tenderness that returned to Daniel's soul, and the faith to believe that even in loss, new beginnings can rise. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded. There's always a reason to open your door again. There's always a little one waiting to come home. The storm raged like a furious beast, swallowing everything in its path. But amidst the howling wind and crashing waves, something struggled against the current. A black plastic bag, barely afloat. Inside, a tiny, helpless puppy fought for its life. On the riverbank, Thomas, an old fisherman, squinted through the rain, his heart clenched as he spotted the moving bag drifting away. Without hesitation, he plunged into the icy waters. What he pulled out was more than just a half-drowned puppy. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. But he had no idea yet that this moment would change his life forever. The rain pounded against the earth like a relentless drum, turning the river into a raging beast. The wind howled through the trees, bending their branches as if they were mere twigs. Thunder cracked overhead, momentarily illuminating the darkened sky. Beneath that furious storm, something barely floated, tossed and swallowed by the merciless currents. A black plastic bag, twisted and contorted by the waves, bobbed up and down before being dragged further downstream. Inside that bag, a tiny golden retriever puppy trembled, its small body barely able to move. The pup, no older than 6 weeks, was soaked to the bone, its golden fur matted and clinging to its frail frame. It had been separated from its mother far too soon, and now it was suffocating, gasping for air as water seeped into the tiny gaps of the bag. Every instinct screamed for survival, but the odds were against it. Not far from the river's edge, Thomas Whitmore sat in his old fishing boat, cursing the storm under his breath. The 70-year-old fisherman had lived by this river his entire life, and he had never seen it this wild before. The years had weathered him. His broad shoulders had begun to hunch. His strong hands now bore deep lines from decades of hauling nets and mending sails. His face was a roadmap of time, his thick gray beard tangled from neglect. Thomas had always been a man of solitude. Ever since his wife, Margaret, passed 15 years ago, he had drifted through life much like his boat on a still morning, slow, steady, and without direction. His son had left for the city long ago, barely keeping in touch. The river was all he had left. But something in the water caught his eye. At first, he thought it was nothing more than debris, a piece of trash thrown away like so many things in this world. But then, the bag moved. Thomas squinted through the sheets of rain. It was small, too small for just garbage. Then he saw it. Something inside was struggling. His heart clenched. Without a second thought, he grabbed his long wooden pole and leaned dangerously over the edge of his boat, trying to hook the drifting bag before the river swallowed it completely. The waves fought against him, the wind nearly toppling him over, but he refused to let go. After a few agonizing moments, the bag snagged on his pole. Thomas pulled with all his might, gritting his teeth as his old muscles strained against the force of the current. With one final yank, he hauled the soaked bag onto his boat, water spilling from its torn edges. His hands shook as he ripped it open. A gasp caught in his throat. A tiny golden retriever puppy lay there, barely breathing. Its fur, which should have been a beautiful shade of golden cream, was now soaked, its tiny body trembling violently from the cold. Its dark eyes, wide with fear, locked onto his, pleading for warmth, for safety, for life. "Jesus!" Thomas muttered, his hands, rough and calloused, gently scooped up the fragile pup, holding it close to his chest. It was ice cold, its tiny heart pounding erratically. No time to hesitate. He turned his boat toward the shore, pushing the motor harder than he had in years. The storm fought him every step of the way, but Thomas was determined. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, his boat scraped against the muddy riverbank. He jumped off, cradling the puppy against his rain-soaked coat as he rushed toward his cabin. His boots splashed through the puddles, his breath coming in heavy puffs as he forced his tired legs to move faster. The cabin was small, nothing more than a wooden structure weathered by time. Once, it had been a home, filled with laughter and warmth. Now, it was a shelter for an old man who had long since stopped expecting company. Inside, the air was cold. The fire had nearly died out, leaving only weak embers glowing in the hearth. With practiced hands, Thomas set the puppy down on a blanket near the fireplace, quickly tossing in more logs and stoking the flames back to life. The golden glow flickered across the tiny body lying still on the floor. "You're a stubborn little thing," Thomas murmured as he knelt beside the puppy, rubbing its tiny body to bring warmth back into its bones. The pup whimpered softly, barely moving. Its tiny ears twitched, as if responding to his voice. Thomas felt something in his chest tighten. It had been so long since he had cared for anything other than himself. The last time he had held something this small, this helpless, had been years ago, when his son was just a boy, when his wife was still alive, when life had felt full instead of empty. A bitter memory surfaced. His son had once found a stray puppy and begged to keep it. Thomas had said no. They couldn't afford another mouth to feed, and he had always believed that stray dogs never lasted long. He had been right. The dog had vanished a few weeks later, and his son had cried for days. Now, looking at this tiny creature, clinging to life against all odds, Thomas felt something stir within him. Regret, perhaps. Or maybe, just maybe, a second chance. "You're not going anywhere," he said, voice gruff but gentle. He reached for an old flannel blanket and wrapped the puppy carefully, holding it close to his chest as he sat down in his worn-out armchair. The storm outside raged on, but inside, for the first time in years, there was warmth. Thomas sat by the fire, his old hands carefully rubbing the damp fur of the tiny golden retriever wrapped in a flannel blanket. The warmth of the fire flickered against its small body, chasing away the chill that had threatened to take it. The puppy was still trembling, its eyes heavy with exhaustion, but there was something in the way it nestled against him that made his chest tighten. Trust. Blind, unconditional trust, he sighed, glancing out the small window. The storm outside showed no sign of relenting, the rain still pounding against the roof, the wind rattling the wooden walls of the cabin. He ran his rough fingers gently over the pup's head, feeling the softness beneath the dirt. It needed a name, something fitting. "River," he murmured, almost testing the word on his tongue. The name felt right. After all, that was where he had found it, where it had fought against the currents, refusing to let go. A survivor. Just like him. River's small ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but it remained curled in his arms, too tired to move. Thomas leaned back in his worn-out chair, the warmth of the fire wrapping around both of them. His mind drifted, carried away by the quiet crackling of the flames. And then, unbidden, the past crept in. It had been more than 20 years, but the memory was as sharp as ever. Another storm. Another night like this. And another dog. Max. Max had been his hunting companion, a strong, loyal hound with deep brown eyes and a coat as dark as the earth itself. Unlike River, Max had not been found. He had been chosen. Thomas had raised him from a pup, trained him, cared for him, trusted him. They had been inseparable, until that night. The night of the accident, Thomas could still hear the rushing water, the same river that had nearly taken River tonight. Max had chased something, maybe a deer, maybe nothing at all, but the ground had been slick, the banks unstable. One misstep, and Max had gone tumbling into the current. Thomas had run, desperate, screaming his name into the storm. But the river had been cruel. He had jumped in, fought against the same violent waters that had tried to claim River tonight, but it had been too late. Max was gone. Thomas had never forgiven himself. The weight of that night had settled on his shoulders like an invisible burden, one he had carried for decades. It was why he never got another dog, why he had never let himself care again. But now, as he looked down at the tiny creature sleeping against his chest, he felt something he hadn't in years, something that scared him. Hope. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean by the rain. The river had calmed, though its banks were still swollen with the aftermath. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine through the cracks in the cabin's walls. Thomas stirred in his chair, blinking at the weak morning light seeping through the window. The weight on his chest shifted, and for a moment he panicked, until he looked down. River was still there, curled up, its small body rising and falling with each steady breath. For the first time in years, Thomas didn't wake up alone. He gently unwrapped the puppy from the blanket, setting it down on the rug near the fireplace. River whimpered at the loss of warmth, but didn't wake. Thomas rubbed his stiff joints, standing with a quiet groan. His body always ached in the mornings. Age had seen to that. He moved toward the small wooden counter, setting water to boil over the old stove. His cabin was simple, built for function, not comfort. The wooden beams had darkened over time, and the shelves were cluttered with relics of a life that had once been fuller. Margaret's ceramic mugs, his son's old fishing rod, a photograph in a dusty frame that he hadn't looked at in years. As the kettle whistled, Thomas poured himself a cup of black coffee, the bitterness familiar and grounding. He glanced at River, who stirred slightly, stretching its tiny legs before curling up tighter. The pup needed food. With practice motions, he reached into the small cabinet and pulled out a can of old soup, then hesitated. No, the puppy couldn't eat that. He frowned, thinking. He had some eggs. Maybe some milk. Before he could start, there was a knock at the door. Thomas frowned. No one ever came out this far. His cabin was at the edge of the river, past the main town. People didn't visit unless they had a reason. He set down his coffee and moved to the door, unlocking it with a quick twist. Standing on the porch was Sarah Bennett. Sarah had lived in town her entire life, just like him. She was in her mid-60s, but time had been kind to her. Tall and lean, with sharp green eyes that saw more than she let on. She had always been a woman who carried herself with quiet strength, the kind that came from years of surviving life's hardships. Her hair, once a rich auburn, had faded into a soft silver, always tied back in a loose braid. She wore a thick coat, a scarf wrapped tight against the morning chill. "You look like hell," she said, her voice dry, though not unkind. Thomas snorted. "Good morning to you, too." Sarah glanced past him, her gaze settling on something inside. "You got company?" He hesitated, then stepped aside enough for her to see. She blinked. "That a dog?" "A pup." She frowned. "That's not yours?" "No," Thomas admitted. "Found it in the river last night." Sarah exhaled, shaking her head. "Damn people. Tossing animals like trash." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, shaking off the rain from her coat. She had been a school teacher before she retired, and she still carried the habit of taking charge in situations whether people wanted her to or not. Thomas closed the door behind her, watching as she knelt near the fireplace. River, now partially awake, sniffed the air but didn't move. Sarah softened, reaching out gently. "Poor thing." Thomas crossed his arms. "You know anything about taking care of puppies?" She gave him a look. "I raised 3 kids and ran a farm for 30 years. What do you think?" He grunted. Sarah sighed, standing. "I'll bring by some proper food later. Puppy formula, maybe some blankets." "I don't need help." "I wasn't asking." She pulled on her gloves. "Keep it warm, make sure it eats. And Thomas..." He looked up. Her expression softened, just slightly. "Maybe it's not the worst thing, letting something in again." With that, she left, leaving Thomas standing in the quiet cabin, the weight of her words lingering in the air. He looked back at River, who had finally lifted its head, blinking at him with those trusting brown eyes. Thomas exhaled. Maybe Sarah was right. The days turned into weeks, and before Thomas realized it, River had become more than just a stray puppy he had rescued. The little golden retriever grew fast, its soft golden fur thickening, taking on a warm, almost sunlit hue. Its body became stronger, its legs more steady, and soon, the once fragile creature that had fit into Thomas's hands was bounding around the cabin with a clumsy enthusiasm that made even the gruff old fisherman crack the rare smile. Thomas had never intended to keep the pup. At first, he told himself it was temporary, just until River was strong enough to be given to someone else. But with each passing day, that thought became less and less convincing. River followed him everywhere, from the small wooden dock where Thomas repaired his fishing nets to the shed where he kept old tools no longer in use. The dog had a way of slipping under his chair when he sat outside in the evenings, its head resting against his boot, as if it had always belonged there. Most nights, Thomas would wake up to find River curled beside his chair near the fireplace, just like Max had once done. It was an odd habit, one he hadn't taught. He had tried making River sleep on an old cushion in the corner, but every morning he would find the dog back by his side, nose tucked into his leg, ears twitching as if listening for the rhythm of his breath. Then there was the barking. River, despite its gentle nature, had a sharp sense of alertness. Whenever someone approached the cabin, whether it was Sarah bringing supplies or the occasional lost traveler stopping to ask for directions, the pup would let out a deep, resonant bark, its stance protective. It wasn't aggression, just a natural wariness, the same instinct Max had once displayed. Thomas never had to teach Max to guard the house, just like he never had to teach River now. But the strangest thing happened one crisp autumn morning. Thomas had taken River for a walk along the riverbank, the morning mist still clinging to the surface of the water. The golden leaves rustled gently under his boots, and River trotted ahead, tail wagging, nose buried in the damp earth. It had rained the night before, and the scent of wet foliage lingered in the air. The dog was playful, darting back and forth, chasing the wind as if it were something tangible. Then, suddenly, River froze, its ears perked up, its body stiffening. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked, his brow furrowing. River didn't respond at first. Instead, it took a few cautious steps forward before lowering its nose to the ground, sniffing intensely. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, it raised a paw and placed it down carefully, hesitant, almost reverent. That's when Thomas saw it, a scar, a faint, nearly invisible scar just above River's front left paw. His breath caught in his throat. It was in the exact same place Max had once been injured. Thomas felt his knees weaken, the weight of something unspoken pressing down on him. It was impossible. He had seen Max go under, had felt the River's cruelty take him away. There was no logic to it, no explanation that made sense. And yet, as he stared at River, who now looked back at him with those same deep, soulful eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at his chest. Had the universe somehow given Max back to him? "You're just imagining things," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head as if to dismiss the thought. But even as he walked back to the cabin, River padding beside him, the unease remained. Later that evening, as Thomas sat in his worn-out chair by the fire, River curled up beside him, pressing its warm body against his leg. The old fisherman absent-mindedly ran his fingers through the dog's fur, his mind lost in memories. He thought about all the nights he had spent alone, staring at the same flickering fire, listening to the same howling wind outside. He had never questioned why he had chosen to live like this, away from the world, away from people. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was just easier to forget when no one was around to remind him. But now, with River beside him, the cabin no longer felt quite so empty. Sarah had noticed the change too. The next time she stopped by, arms full of supplies, she eyed the dog with an amused smirk. "You're keeping it," she said matter-of-factly, setting down a bag of fresh food on the counter. Thomas grunted. "Never said that." Sarah crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. "Uh-huh. And yet, he's sleeping in your chair, eating food from your kitchen, and following you around like a shadow." Thomas grumbled something incoherent under his breath, but Sarah wasn't fooled. She had known him too long. "What's his name?" she asked. "River." A slow, knowing smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Fitting," she said, "considering where he came from." Thomas didn't respond, just reached for his coffee, pretending to be uninterested. But Sarah wasn't one to let things go so easily. You ever think, she continued, that sometimes life gives us second chances in ways we don't expect? He stiffened slightly, his fingers tightening around the mug. He didn't look at her, but she didn't need him to answer. Sarah had always been perceptive. It was part of who she was. Sharp-eyed, quietly observant. She had spent her whole life reading people, first as a school teacher, then as a mother, and later, after her husband passed, as the unofficial caretaker of the small riverside town. She wasn't the type to pry, but she also wasn't the type to ignore the things left unsaid. She reached down, scratching River behind the ears. "You know," she mused, "dogs have a way of finding the people who need them the most." Thomas exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his tired face. He didn't have a response to that. Sarah stood, brushing off her coat. "I'll be back in a few days. Try not to scare him off with all that grumbling." As she left, Thomas remained seated, watching the firelight dance in River's dark eyes. The dog looked up at him, tail thumping once against the floor. Thomas sighed. "Looks like you're staying, then?" River licked his hand, settling deeper against his leg. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas let himself believe, just a little, that maybe, just maybe, life wasn't done with him yet. The evening sky was heavy with dark clouds, pressing low over the quiet river town. A thick humidity hung in the air, clinging to everything like an unspoken omen. Thomas had seen storms before, plenty of them, but something about tonight felt different. The wind carried an eerie stillness, a deceptive calm, that only deepened the unease twisting in his gut. River sensed it too. The young golden retriever had spent the entire evening restless, pacing near the front door, ears pricked at sounds only he could hear. Normally River would curl up beside Thomas's chair, content to rest by the fire, but tonight was different. The pup's golden coat bristled as he let out a deep, rumbling growl, staring toward the window as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. Thomas watched him, setting down his mug of coffee. "What's got into you, boy?" River didn't respond. He never did to idle words. But his body stiffened, and then without warning, he bolted toward the door, barking wildly. His front paws scratched against the wood, desperate. Thomas frowned, the unease in his stomach tightening. River was not the kind of dog to make a fuss over nothing. Grabbing his coat, Thomas pushed open the door. The moment he did, River shot past him into the night, paws kicking up damp earth as he ran toward the riverbank. The old fisherman hesitated only for a second before following. The moment he stepped outside, he knew something was wrong. The air was thick with moisture, the kind that clung to his skin and made breathing feel heavier. The sky rumbled ominously, though no rain had fallen yet. The river, normally steady and predictable, was moving faster than usual, swollen from the previous week's rainfall. Then he saw it. A long, jagged crack running along the side of the earthen dam just beyond his property. Thomas's breath hitched. The dam had been there for decades, built to control the river's flow during storms. It had withstood countless floods, its structure a silent guardian of the town. But now, beneath the weight of the rising waters, it was failing. And nobody knew. River barked furiously, circling the damaged section, his paws kicking up loose soil. The message was clear. Do something. Thomas didn't waste time. He turned and ran, his boots sinking into the wet ground as he sprinted toward town. He hadn't run this fast in years, but fear pushed him forward, ignoring the burn in his legs. By the time he reached the town center, sweat dripped from his brow despite the cold air. He burst into the small municipal office where a handful of town officials were finishing up their day. Sheriff Mark Calloway was among them, a man in his mid-40s with broad shoulders and a perpetual look of skepticism. He had lived in the town his whole life, a firm believer in logic and practicality. His uniform was neatly pressed, his dark hair combed back, but his eyes carried the weariness of someone who had long stopped believing in emergencies that weren't immediate. Thomas stormed in, chest heaving. "The dam," he managed between breaths. "It's breaking." Calloway barely looked up from his paperwork. "Thomas, it's been there for 50 years. It's fine." "It's not fine," Thomas snapped. "There's a crack running through it and the water's rising. If that thing goes, the entire lower town is gone." A few of the other officials exchanged glances, but Calloway only sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, Thomas, we'll check it in the morning." "Morning?" Thomas's voice rose with frustration. "By morning, there won't be a damn town left. I'm sure it's just—" The lights flickered. A low, guttural rumble vibrated through the floor. followed by a distant but unmistakable sound, a roar, deep and primal. The dam was breaking. Then, as if the sky itself had been waiting for its cue, the first drop of rain fell. Then another. Within seconds, it was pouring. Someone screamed outside. The distant sound of rushing water reached them before they even saw it. Calloway bolted to his feet, finally understanding. "God help us!" Chaos erupted. People shouted orders, grabbing radios and ringing emergency bells. The town had protocols for floods, but no one had expected this. Thomas didn't wait. He turned and ran back toward his cabin. The rain lashed against his skin as he fought against the storm, his boots slipping in the thickening mud. He could hear it now. The river. No longer just a river, but a beast, roaring as it tore through the weakened dam, swallowing everything in its path. The ground trembled beneath him. Then the wall of water came. It moved with terrifying speed, a force that cared nothing for the lives in its way. Thomas barely had time to react before he felt the impact. The wave slammed into him, knocking him off his feet, the icy grip of the flood dragging him under. For a moment, everything was chaos. Water filled his ears, his lungs burned, and the world became nothing but a swirling abyss of darkness. He fought, kicking, clawing, but the current was stronger. It pulled him under, twisting his body like a rag doll. He was going to die, and then something latched onto him. A grip, firm and unyielding. River. The dog had leaped into the flood without hesitation. His teeth clamped onto Thomas's sleeve, his body working against the current, paddling with every ounce of strength he had. Thomas coughed, barely conscious, but the warmth of River's body against him kept him tethered to reality. Through sheer determination, the dog pulled him toward a half-submerged tree, where Thomas managed to grab hold, gasping for air. The water still raged, but they had a lifeline. River whimpered, his fur slicked against his body, but he did not let go. Thomas, his limbs shaking, pulled himself up, wrapping an arm around River to keep him close. The storm raged on, but they were alive. And as Thomas looked into the dog's exhausted but determined eyes, he knew, without a doubt, River had saved him. Just as Max had tried to, all those years ago. Thomas gasped awake, his body aching as if he had been trampled by a freight train. His head pounded, his limbs felt sluggish, and for a moment he couldn't remember where he was. The world around him was eerily quiet, save for the distant roar of water and the occasional creak of shifting wood beneath him. Then it came back to him. The flood, the dam breaking, the wave that had swallowed him whole. He had been drowning, dragged by the current, and then River. His eyes snapped open fully. He was on the roof of his cabin, the only part of his home that hadn't been completely submerged. The waters had risen high, swallowing the first floor, leaving only the slanted shingles of the roof as a fragile sanctuary. Beside him, River stood, soaked to the bone, his golden fur clinging to his thin frame. The dog was trembling, his body racked with exhaustion, but he didn't sit. He stayed close, watchful, as if making sure Thomas was still breathing. "Good boy," Thomas rasped, reaching out with a shaking hand. River pressed his nose into his palm, his eyes filled with that quiet, unwavering trust. The sky was a dull gray, the storm's fury finally beginning to wane, but the devastation it left behind stretched for miles. Thomas could see broken trees, bits of shattered homes, and household debris floating past in the current. The river, once a familiar friend, had become something monstrous. Then he heard it. A cry. Faint but desperate. Thomas turned his head sharply, searching the waterlogged wasteland. The cry came again, high-pitched, terrified. And then he saw it. A child. No older than 5 or 6, clinging to a half-submerged tree as the current dragged them further downstream. A boy, small and frail, wearing a soaked red jacket. His tiny fingers were wrapped around the bark with a death grip, his face twisted in terror. Thomas's heart clenched. He tried to move, but his body was still weak, his limbs sluggish. He could barely keep himself upright on the roof. There was no way he could swim through that water and reach the child in time. Then, beside him, River moved. The dog's ears pricked forward, his gaze locked onto the boy. He turned to Thomas, then back at the struggling child, as if he understood what needed to be done. Thomas opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, River leaped. The golden retriever hit the water with a splash, disappearing beneath the churning waves for a second before resurfacing. His legs pumped furiously, his body cutting through the water with powerful, determined strokes. Thomas held his breath. The current was brutal, slamming River sideways, but the dog didn't waver. He pushed forward, his head barely above the water as he fought against the tide. Closer, closer. The boy's eyes widened as River reached him. The child let out a choked sob, his fingers slipping against the wet bark. He wouldn't last much longer. Then, River did something remarkable. Instead of trying to grab the boy directly, the dog bit down on the fabric of his jacket, tugging him with surprising gentleness. The boy gasped, his grip faltering, but River held steady. Slowly, inch by inch, he pulled him away from the sinking tree, guiding him back toward Thomas and the fragile safety of the rooftop. Thomas crawled forward, reaching as far as he could. "Come on, boy, just a little more." River swam with everything he had. His muscles burned, his limbs screamed for rest, but he kept going. The water fought back, the current twisting and pulling, but he refused to let go. Then, a log, thick, jagged, a piece of shattered debris carried by the flood, moving too fast for Thomas to shout a warning. It slammed into River with brutal force. The dog let out a sharp, pained yelp, his body flipping sideways in the water. His jaws instinctively released the boy's jacket, and for a heart-stopping second, everything stopped. Then the current took him. River was gone. Thomas's world blurred. "No!" He lunged, barely managing to grab the boy's jacket as he drifted past. With the last of his strength, he hauled the child onto the rooftop, his own body nearly slipping with the effort. He clutched the shivering boy close, but his eyes remained locked on the water, scanning frantically. River had saved the boy, but the river had taken River. The old fisherman's breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion and grief. He searched the water, his vision blurring with something hot and stinging, though he refused to call it tears. River had been there, and now he wasn't. "Please," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible against the roaring current. But the river didn't answer. It only raged on, carrying away the one thing he hadn't been ready to lose. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world broken and bruised. The morning light struggled to pierce through the heavy gray sky, casting a pale, somber glow over the devastated town. The floodwaters had begun to recede, revealing the skeletons of what once stood. Collapsed houses, shattered fences, uprooted trees. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, debris, and the faint staleness of stagnant water. Thomas stood on the ruined remains of his cabin's rooftop, his body stiff and aching from the cold. The boy he had pulled from the river huddled close, wrapped in the tattered remains of Thomas's old coat. The child, no older than 5 or 6, had dark curls that clung to his forehead, his face smudged with mud and exhaustion. His brown eyes, wide and fearful, darted around as if searching for something familiar in the sea of destruction. People had begun emerging from their battered homes, assessing the damage, calling out for loved ones. Miraculously, there had been no reported deaths. Thanks to Thomas's warning, the town had evacuated to higher ground before the worst of the flood struck. But survival came with a cost. Their homes were in ruins, their belongings washed away, their lives forever changed. Sheriff Calloway arrived first, his uniform stained with mud, his usual composed demeanor replaced with one of weary urgency. His blue eyes, usually sharp and observant, were dulled by exhaustion. He had spent the night coordinating rescues, pulling people from rooftops and guiding them to safety. Now, as he approached Thomas, his gaze softened at the sight of the boy. "Jesus, Whitmore," Calloway muttered, crouching beside them. "You saved him?" Thomas, still breathless, gave a stiff nod. River did. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. At the mention of the dog, Calloway's expression turned grim. He glanced at the murky water still pooling around them. "Where is he?" Thomas clenched his jaw. He had been searching, scanning the river, the wreckage, the debris, but there was nothing. No golden fur cutting through the water, no familiar bark, no sign of River. His chest tightened. The dog had saved him, had saved this boy, and now he was gone. The boy, silent until now, sniffled. His voice was small, barely audible. "Doggy?" Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat. "We're gonna find him, kid." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. The hours passed like a slow, agonizing blur. As soon as the boy was safely placed in the care of the town's emergency shelter, Thomas joined the search efforts. He trudged through the mud, his old boots sinking with every step, his hands raw from lifting debris, from pushing through the wreckage of what the flood had left behind. Sarah arrived sometime in the afternoon, her gray braid damp from rain, her coat splattered with dirt. Her face, usually calm and composed, was lined with worry. She didn't ask questions, she simply joined him. They searched together, side by side, combing through the ruins along the riverbank, calling River's name into the silent wasteland. Others helped too, men who had known Thomas for years, women who had once dismissed him as a gruff old man with nothing left to lose. But today, no one questioned his desperation, because they had all seen what River had done. As the sun began its slow descent, exhaustion weighed heavily on Thomas's shoulders. The ache in his bones was nothing compared to the grief settling in his chest. Maybe River was gone. Maybe, just like Max, the river had taken him. Thomas felt something inside him break at the thought. Then, just as he was about to stop, he heard it. A sound. Faint, weak, but unmistakable. A whimper. His heart slammed against his ribs. He spun toward the direction of the noise, feet moving before his mind could catch up. Near the base of an old oak tree, tangled in a mess of broken branches and waterlogged debris, lay a small golden shape. River. The dog was barely moving, his wet fur matted with mud and leaves, his body shivering violently. One of his back legs was twisted at an odd angle, and a deep gash marred his side. His breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of his chest labored and slow. But he was alive. Thomas fell to his knees beside him, his hands trembling as they reached out, brushing against River's damp fur. The dog's eyes fluttered open at the touch, and despite everything, his tail gave the faintest wag. "You stupid, stubborn mutt," Thomas choked out, his voice thick with emotion. River whimpered again, his head weakly pressing into Thomas's palm. Sarah knelt beside them, exhaling shakily. "We need to get him warm. Fast." Thomas didn't hesitate. He scooped the dog into his arms, ignoring the protest in his joints, ignoring the mud that smeared across his shirt. He held River close, feeling the slow, fragile beat of his heart against his chest. The old fisherman, who had spent so many years believing he had no one left to lose, felt his eyes sting. He had almost lost him. Almost. River shivered in his grip, but he was still breathing. And as long as he was breathing, Thomas wasn't letting go. As he carried the dog back toward what was left of his home, Sarah walking beside him, he whispered something into River's ear. A promise. "You're gonna be okay, boy. I got you." And this time, no force of nature was going to take him away. River's recovery was slow but steady. The first few weeks were the hardest. The injuries from the flood had left the young golden retriever weak, unable to stand without trembling. His back leg, once strong and swift, now bore the weight of the trauma, healing with a slight limp that would never fully disappear. The deep gash along his side had closed, but the scar remained, a permanent reminder of the night he had given everything to save a life. Thomas rarely left his side. The man who had once lived in solitude, who had spent years convincing himself he needed no one, now found himself watching over River like a worried parent. He set up an old quilted blanket near the fireplace, making sure the pup was warm. Every morning he gently cleaned the wound with careful hands, his rough fingers surprisingly soft against River's fur. He boiled chicken and rice, feeding the dog small portions, coaxing him to eat even when the pain dulled his appetite. River, despite the pain, never once turned away from him. Their bond had deepened, forged through the storm, through loss, through survival. Sarah came by often, bringing supplies, medicinal salves for River's wounds, fresh food, and sometimes just company. She never said much about what had happened that night, never spoke of how close Thomas had come to losing the dog. But she watched the way he moved now, how he reached down to scratch River's ears absent-mindedly, how his gruff exterior softened whenever the dog whimpered in pain. "You love that dog," she remarked one evening, sipping coffee on his front porch. Thomas grunted, which was his way of agreeing. Sarah smirked. "You're a terrible liar." Thomas didn't argue. Instead, he looked out toward the river, now calm and unassuming, as if it had never been the monstrous force that nearly took everything from them. The town had begun to rebuild. The damage left by the flood was severe, but not beyond repair. Houses were being restored, streets cleared of debris. Neighbors who had once only exchanged polite greetings now worked together, sharing meals, lending tools, offering hands to lift what was too heavy alone. And in the middle of it all, they talked about River, the dog that had warned them of the dam, the dog that had saved a child, a hero. People stopped by the cabin more than ever before, asking about River, offering him treats, scratching behind his ears as they told Thomas, "That dog of yours, Whitmore, he's something special." Thomas didn't disagree. Months passed, and River grew stronger. His limp remained, but he learned to adjust. He chased after butterflies in the field behind the cabin, barked at fish in the shallows of the river, napped in the shade of the old oak tree. But no matter what, he never strayed too far from Thomas. The old fisherman had changed too. He no longer sat alone at the river's edge, lost in old memories. He no longer grumbled when Sarah dropped by unannounced, pretending not to enjoy her company. He even made an effort to visit the town, something he hadn't done in years. Because now, he wasn't just Thomas Whitmore, the old man by the river. He was River's owner, the man who had saved a dog, only to be saved by him in return. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Thomas sat on the porch, watching River doze beside him. The golden fur shimmered under the fading light, the soft rise and fall of his breath steady, peaceful. Thomas reached down, running a hand over the scar along River's side. "You scared the hell out of me. You know that?" he muttered. River's tail thumped once against the wooden planks, as if to say, "Yeah, I know." Thomas exhaled, leaning back against his chair, staring at the horizon. For years, he had lived believing he was meant to be alone, that solitude was easier, that there was no point in holding on to things, because life had a cruel way of taking them away. But River had proven him wrong. Love wasn't about holding on too tight. It was about standing beside each other, through storms and stillness alike. And Thomas knew, as long as he had River by his side, he would never be alone again. Not anymore, not ever. Life has a way of leading us down unexpected paths. Sometimes, it takes a storm, both the ones outside and the ones within, to remind us of what truly matters. Thomas believed he was destined to be alone. That loss was something he had to endure, in silence. But God had other plans. River wasn't just a dog, he was a miracle, a living testament to the love and loyalty that God places in the hearts of his creations. Just as Thomas had pulled River from the river that fateful night, River, in turn, saved Thomas, not just from the flood, but from a life of loneliness and regret. God's miracles aren't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes, they come in the form of a loyal companion, a second chance, a reason to open our hearts again. River's story is a reminder that love, no matter where it comes from, is a gift from God, one that should never be taken for granted. If this story touched your heart, we encourage you to share it with others. Maybe someone out there needs to be reminded that even in the darkest storms, God's light still shines through. Comment below if you've ever had an animal change your life, or if you believe like Thomas that sometimes God sends us exactly who we need at the right time. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories like this. Stories of faith, love, and the miracles that walk among us, sometimes on four legs. May God bless you, protect you, and fill your life with the unconditional love that only He can provide. Amen.